I'd like to welcome everyone to our fourth author this evening in our Writers, Speakers, and Ideas series for the semester. For everyone who just signed in, or generally speaking, these take place on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. and each talk and question and answer session lasts about an hour. And you can find an event or a list of these events on our website at the Writers, Speakers, and Ideas on the Lone Star College website. My contact information for those of you who want it, if you want to ask me, I'm going to put it into the chat box here. If you want to get in touch with me about this event or any other event, there it is, john.m.barr@lonestar.edu. In 2 weeks, on October the 13th, we have Rice University philosopher George Scher, who is going to give a talk entitled "You're Not Trying." At one point or another, he argues that most of us have been accused of not trying our hardest, and most of us have leveled similar accusations at others, he says. And so the topics discussed in that talk will include what trying one's hardest actually involves, the conditions under which such accusations are true, and the question of how much those truths matter. So that should be a very interesting talk. But tonight we have Katherine Stewart, who is here to talk about her book, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And here is a copy of the book and more on her biography in just a minute. Let me explain the format for the evening. After I give you a little bit of Katherine's background, she's going to talk for maybe 20 minutes or so about her book, some of the major themes and ideas. I'll probably ask her 2 or 3 questions, and then we will turn it over to everybody in the audience. And you can either put the question in the chat box if you want, or in the Q&A box at the bottom right there. It's just up to you. And I will read off the questions to Katherine, and she will answer them. So, Katherine Stewart has been reporting at the intersection of religion, politics, policy, and education for over a decade. She has contributed to the New York Times, the American Prospect, Washington Post, the Atlantic, the Advocate, the Guardian, and Religion Dispatches. Her previous book, The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children, was published in 2012. She has also published 2 novels and co-wrote a book about the musical Rent. And she is here with us again, as I said earlier, to talk with us about her new book, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Thank you, Katherine. Welcome, and give her a nice round of applause at home. So it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Grateful to you for taking time out of your evening to check in. And I want to thank, of course, Lone Star College. Thank you, John Barr. I'm grateful to you for making this happen. And after I speak, I'm really hoping to hear from all of you out there. So these are challenging times for all of us. And it would be really nice to imagine an America in which we could look forward to a moment of national unity at a time like this, in the face of an external threat like a global pandemic, or in the face of an economic crisis for so many families, or even a moment of coming together after a national election. But we all know that that's unfortunately not likely in America right now. It seems like we're more divided than at any time in recent memory. So the question is why? I want to talk about one part of the answer. I don't think we can fully explain our divisions today without addressing the rise of religious nationalism in America. So religious nationalism, what many commentators in the United States refer to as Christian nationalism, it's not on the fringes of American political life anymore. It's at the center of power. So I want to start this discussion with an explanation of what it is and what it is not. Christian nationalism is basically the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and that our laws should be based on the Bible. It's the idea that we've moved away from this conception of America and somehow we have to get back to that. This ideology is anti-democratic because it says that the foundation of legitimate government in the United States is in a particular religion, and it insists that that's what makes us distinctive, the religious identity of our country, rather than our democratic system of government, and the fact that we live in a democratic republic, or our Constitution, or our history of assimilating very diverse people, however imperfectly, in a pluralist society. Christian nationalism is also a means of mobilizing and often manipulating a large subsection of the public, a way of persuading them to vote for the candidates, the political candidates that the movement favors. So now I want to say something about what Christian nationalism is not. The first thing to know is that it is not a religion. Religious nationalism makes use of religion, but it's not just trying to achieve religious, social, or cultural aims. It's trying to achieve political power. It's an obvious point, but we need to say it over and over again, that Christian nationalism is not synonymous with Christianity. In fact, a good many Christians question whether it is an authentic reflection of the faith in the first place. Now, let me say something else about what the movement is not. It is not just about evangelicals. A lot of people talk about, white evangelicals. Well, certainly the movement includes many white evangelicals too, but it excludes many white evangelicals as well. And it excludes an overwhelming number of evangelicals of color. The movement has been shaped in profound ways by certain aspects of hyper-conservative Catholicism. And strange to say, Christian nationalism receives some support from some individuals and groups that do not identify as Christian at all. So here's something else the movement's not. It's not just about symbolism. It's not just about crosses on public land or, people saying Merry Christmas. The thing that's at stake here in the rise of the religious nationalism in the United States is not whether we merely blur the line between church and state, or whether we're offending the feelings of some outgroup. The thing that's at stake is the most fundamental organization of our political system. It's about whether the United States will continue as a constitutional democracy in a pluralist society, united by an idea, the idea of a democratic republic, or not. Now, to be clear, it's possible to express one's faith in the public square and in politics while respecting the separation of church and state. Many leaders do so while acknowledging the pluralism and diversity of our nation. On the other hand, there are those that seek to use the power of the state to impose the supposedly correct religious viewpoints on everyone else. I think of the latter as advocates for Christian nationalism. That is, they're making use of theological frameworks in order to justify political power over other people and groups. The movement, which I write about in my book, The Power Worshippers, consists of a dense ecosystem of nonprofit, for-profit, religious and non-religious groups. I think we can't really understand what we're dealing with unless you understand how the movement works on a granular level. And that's why I wrote The Power Worshippers. Many of the movement's leading figures have entrenched themselves into the highest levels of our governing institutions in ways that will long outlast the current administration. The leadership cadre and their supporters and allies have spent many hundreds of millions of dollars over decades building all of the features of modern campaign infrastructure, data and media and messaging, advocacy organizations, policy groups, legal activist groups, think tanks, very sophisticated data initiatives. So it's a robust system because it consists of a very sophisticated machinery that has been built up over time. In election seasons, the movement acts to transform many of America's conservative churches into what are essentially partisan political cells. They really target conservative Christians to vote, and they get them to vote for the candidates that the movement favors. So I want to talk a little bit about how that machinery targets churches and faith leaders. Leaders of the movement know that pastors drive votes. People tend to trust their pastors. And so leaders and organizations of this movement draw pastors into networks to get them all on the same page politically. They figured if you can get the pastors, you can get the people. So I want to give you an idea of what that looks like on the ground. When I was researching my book, I attended a pastors networking event at a church in rural North Carolina with dozens of evangelical pastors from the area. The event was aimed at teaching them how to communicate to their congregations the key issues that supposedly matter in elections and the biblically correct way to vote on them. They know if you can tell people to vote their biblical values and reduce those values to like 3 issues, you can get their vote. The event was organized by Watchmen on the Wall, which is a project of the Family Research Council. Family Research Council, again, is one of the leading policy groups of the religious right, and Watchmen on the Wall is their pastoral organization, and they have tens of thousands of pastor members. So from the moment I walked into this church in North Carolina, I could tell this was not really a politically neutral affair. Speech after speech focused on abortion. It's as a way of signaling to the pastors who were there that this is the issue that should matter most, that they should communicate this issue above all others to their congregations. They know if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote. So pastors were provided with a number of very sophisticated tools for getting out the vote the supposedly correct way, from voter guides to videos for them to show in church, very sophisticated data tools, guidelines for forming teams within their churches to get out the vote for the correct candidates. I attended the event with a friend of mine who's a pastor with a church affiliated with Southern Baptist Convention. Ever since we attended that event, he's been receiving all of these tools in the mail and by email that he forwarded to me. One of these is a sample voter guide sent to him by the Faith and Freedom Coalition. That's another one of the leading policy groups of the movement. It's led by Ralph Reed, who has promised to devote $40 million to this current election cycle. Now, that's just one organization, $40 million, and other organizations have their own budgets. So you can see that there's a lot of money that this movement devotes to election cycles. So let's talk about this voter guide. It's got like 6 questions. 2 of them, really 3 of them have to do with abortion, and they show like Jane Doe, Democrat, versus John Smith, Republican, and abortion on demand. She says yes, he says no. I mean, these are very leading questions. There are these sort of absolute binaries, and when you look at these sample voter guides, they leave absolutely no question as to how the congregants are expected to vote in order to reflect their so-called biblical values. And my friend who is a Bible-believing pastor says, we're putting people into one box or another. Shouldn't care for the poor be a biblical value? Shouldn't caring for the least of these? Shouldn't these other issues, care for the environment, also be biblical values issues? But these types of voter guides really reduce it to abortion, same-sex marriage, or LGBT issues, and issues that the right can create sort of easy yes or no binaries about. So listen, of course, all political parties seek to sharpen their messaging and draw voters to their side during political campaign seasons. Everybody does that. Democrats do it, Republicans do it too. But here's the thing about doing this in a church. By turning churches into partisan political cells, the religious right is exploiting and abusing their unique tax status. They're granted in our laws and in our tax code. Just remember that churches and houses of worship enjoy special tax subsidies, tax exemptions, exemptions from financial transparency laws that other for-profit and nonprofit organizations don't get. So, why do they get these? Well, tax exemption is like a gift from the government. It's a privilege. But in return for that privilege, non-religious, nonprofit organizations have to open their books. So the Internal Revenue Service and the public can see how the money that we are subsidizing them with was spent. Religions don't have to do that. Churches don't have to do that. They're exempt from all that because they have religious status. It's very unique, and it's like a super category of privilege. So in addition, faith-based organizations get a host of tax benefits and subsidies. And of course, they're exempt from anti-discrimination laws that apply to other both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. They alone are allowed to discriminate against people of other faiths, people of other ethnic groups, women, LGBT Americans, even members of racial minority groups. It is precisely for these reasons, they can do that because they're religion, they can do what they want, but precisely for these reasons, these special and unique privileges, that these religious organizations should respect the separation of church and state, refrain from politicking from the pulpit. That is exactly what the separation of church and state is all about. Now let me tell you something about the political messaging of the movement leaders. When they're talking to congregants or talking to the pastors about getting the vote out among their congregants, it's all abortion all the time. In fact, I was at another pastor's event in Chula Vista, California. It was largely for Latino pastors. There was about 400 people in the audience, Latino pastors and their families, and the event was held in Spanish with translators for the Anglo speakers. And one of the speakers, a leader, told this group of pastors, you know, he's telling them how to get their congregants to vote. He said, if someone asks you about the minimum wage, you ask them, what's more important, a few extra dollars or life? I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but that's what he said. He said, when you're talking to your congregants about financial issues, what matters more, you know, money or life? Meaning, you know, the life of, you know, a human life. So, you know, I wish I had more to say, more time to speak to the history of the abortion issue here. But I want to say one thing about it that is central to understanding its role in politics today. The story we have come to accept is that the religious right came together around widespread opposition to abortion, arising from the grassroots up. You know, that Roe versus Wade was passed in 1973 and the people arose in protest. But in fact, leaders of a political movement called the New Right, which is a precursor to today's religious right, really created the abortion issue as we know it now as an us versus them issue to serve political purposes. So let's look what was happening with most Republican Protestants when Roe versus Wade was passed in 1973. At that time, most Protestant Republicans supported it. The Southern Baptist Convention actually hailed the decision. They passed a resolution in 1971 and another one in 1973, which they hailing liberalization of abortion law. At the time, they called passage of Roe versus Wade a sensible middle ground between what they saw as a total ban on abortion and a total deregulation. So they saw it as a sensible middle ground. Many Republican politicians and figures, from Barry Goldwater to Betty Ford, my gosh, I think it was even Billy Graham. He at one point, I think it was in 1968, where he said, "I believe in Planned Parenthood." Billy Graham said that. But, you know, the issue of abortion was later settled on as one that could unite ultra-conservative Protestants with Catholics, ultra-conservative Catholics, I should say, and ignite a hyper-conservative counter-revolution. There was that sort of cohort of leaders. They called themselves the New Right. They were very unhappy with the Republican Party at the time. They saw it as soft on communism. And they wanted to ignite this hyper-conservative counter-revolution. And they settled on the abortion issue as the issue that could actually sort of bring these folks together. So again, you know, when the movement leaders today, they'll distract you from all the stuff that's going on in our politics and say, well, look here at this abortion issue. This is what you should be focused on. But when you look at the political messages today in more detail, and especially the messages that these leaders send to one another and to the elites in power, it is not just about abortion. A lot of it is about money. It's about how the Bible favors low taxes or no taxes for the rich, how the Bible favors minimal government or no government regulation of businesses, about how the Bible is against environmental regulation and against government funding of the social safety net, about how God is hyper-capitalist and doesn't want government to tax the rich or directly fund any initiatives that might help working people. So the religious right claims to stand for family values, but they are embracing economic and social policies that are making it harder for American families to succeed. You know, every year I attend the Values Voters Summit. It's a conference sponsored by the Family Research Council. It features many of the movement leaders and attracts many of its most devoted activists. At last week's Values Voters Summit, Franklin Graham, I'm sure you guys know who he is. He's one of the featured speakers, and he spoke approvingly of our current president, saying he has a vision of the country that existed in the 50s and 60s and wants that back. And we have a vision of an America that existed during the 50s and 60s, and we want that back too. This might be a little bit of a paraphrase, but he mentioned the 50s, and he said, we have that vision of America that existed in the 50s and 60s, we want that back too. So let's think about that, the 50s and 60s. There is a lot to unpack here. During those years, segregation, racial discrimination, and gender discrimination were legal and rampant, from workplaces to schools to housing to financial services. Back then, it was also, by the way, illegal to be gay. But one thing we did have in the 50s and 60s is a lower level of economic inequality. We had a stronger middle class and a more secure white working class. Why is that? Well, in the 1950s, a typical CEO of a company made 20 times the salary of his or her average worker. So 20 times the salary of the average worker, that gives them a pretty nice lifestyle, right? Well, by 2017, CEO pay at a Standard & Poor 500 index firm soared to an average of 361 times more than the average worker. That is a far cry from the situation in the 50s and 60s that Franklin Graham claims to long for. In the 50s and 60s, we had strong labor unions. We had less economic inequality. Today, the level of inequality is, we've got like a winner-take-all economy, and that's making it harder for American families to succeed. So if I'm going to be generous toward Franklin Graham, I might assume that he's nostalgic not for a time that the subordination of people of color and women was enforced by law. I'm going to just assume that he doesn't want that, okay? I'm going to be generous. But I'm assuming that he is longing for a time when the middle class was stronger and the center appeared to hold. And yet, the religious right, I'm nostalgic for those aspects too. But yet the religious right is allied with these libertarian economic groups that have led to the intensification of these inequalities, destroying the middle class and degrading life for working Americans. A lot of this comes down to money, and that's what I learned when I visited a large agricultural fair in California's San Joaquin Valley. I was there to attend the 20th anniversary celebration of Ralph Drollinger. He's the founder of Capital Ministries. It's a group that targets political leaders at the very top levels of government. Drollinger's weekly Bible study in the Capitol has been attended by at least 12 current and former members of Trump's cabinet. He has also established Bible study groups targeting the Senate and the House of Representatives. So he is arguably one of the most politically influential pastors in America. Now, the expansiveness of his positions on domestic, economic, and foreign policy hits home the fact that Christian nationalism is a political movement. It's not just a stance in the so-called culture wars. Drollinger weighs in on a number of social and economic policy questions, including the idea that social welfare programs have no basis in Scripture. He favors tax policies that benefit the very rich, too. And these teachings reflect an unappreciated fact about the movement, which is its long alliance with libertarian, far-right-wing economic wing of the Republican Party. So a lot of the members of the rank and file who end up voting their values on, say, abortion, would in fact want to keep their coverage for pre-existing conditions in healthcare. They themselves might benefit from a higher minimum wage or more job security or better funded public schools for their kids. So, there are other leaders of the movement I wrote about in the Power Worshippers. I wrote about David Barton, who is, I call him the Where's Waldo of the movement. He actually appears on the boards of so many of the various initiatives. He's a very interesting character. He too has argued that the Bible and God oppose progressive income taxes capital gains taxes, and minimum wage laws. So, he actually wrote in a study that he did called The Bible, Slavery, and America's Founders. He wrote different forms of slavery have replaced a more obvious system of past centuries. He's casting things like government aid and job training as a form of slavery. In my view, it's just wrong on so many levels. He's also on the board of an initiative called Project Blitz. It's an organization that crafts model pieces of legislation, allowing legislators to easily introduce bills in different states without needing to research and write the bills themselves. It kind of gets everyone on the same page, in terms of their legislative agenda, everyone with the same political vision. So Project Blitz works along similar lines. The aim is to overwhelm state legislatures with all these different religiously themed bills. Some of them will fail, but many of them will get through, and the center of the debate gets shifted to the right. And the ultimate aim for these things is to secure a license for certain faith groups to discriminate against certain other groups and conflate in the minds of the public their religion with the authority of government. And it's really a way of signaling to everyone through the law that there's a group in America that is privileged and other groups that are not deserving of privilege. These initiatives are often cast in the language of religious liberty, but they are expressions of religious privilege. What movement leaders today want is a trump card to overrule the law where it conflicts with their religious beliefs, and thus to withdraw from the social contract that binds the rest of us together as a nation. I'm going to finish up my talk soon, but I want to point out that, in this moment when, we're thinking about the Supreme Court, it's ironic, but it was the late Justice Scalia who saw the danger best, Antonin Scalia, who saw the danger best when he ruled in the 1990 case, Employment Division versus Smith, that to make an individual's obedience to the law contingent upon the law's coincidence with his religious belief, that was what he wrote. He said, to let an individual let his own religious beliefs guide him which laws to obey and which laws not to. He said it amounts to permitting him by virtue of his beliefs to become a law unto himself. And this, Scalia said, contradicts both constitutional tradition and common sense. So he rightly suggested that simply allowing your religious beliefs in a pluralist society, we've got every religion and none here in America, allowing your own religious beliefs to decide which laws you should or should not follow would be courting anarchy. Now that particular case centered on whether a pair of Native Americans had violated a state ban on the use of peyote, even though their use of the drug was part of their religious ritual. But when the demands were not coming from Native Americans, but from members of a faith group with which he identified, Scalia and his fellows rapidly lost track of the insight. So, when we look at what's happening in America, we often just consider it in Americans' terms, but this is really a global threat that we're seeing play out all around the world. It's a form of identity politics. Religious nationalists in America and beyond always run these identity campaigns to consolidate more authoritarian forms of political power. There's a we that's under threat, a they that we hate, and religion tends to play a vital role in distinguishing between the two. We can see it through history when Franco in Spain or Salazar in Portugal, these right-wing strongmen wanted to consolidate authoritarian forms of power. They relied on alliances with conservative religious movements to sustain their strict regimes. So, in conclusion, I want to say that I understand that a lot of the claims I'm making might seem pessimistic, but, speaking for myself, I consider myself an optimist. I believe we still have the resources to think deeply and deliberately about who we are and what we are as a republic. In fact, I take it that that is the reason why you are here today. We can have these productive conversations, and that is why we're here. So I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to speak with you all, And thanks so much for your participation.
Do you want to leave us with any final words at all, Katherine, before we sign off?
Thanks so much for joining tonight, and thank you so much for caring about our democracy and for caring about one another.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.